They said the river forgets. That time washes away everything that falls into its water. But I learned early that the river remembers. It remembers every voice, every secret, every name it ever swallowed. My name's Simmons, and you're listening to Chronicles of Black. If this story touches something inside you, subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts, because our stories deserve to be heard. The year was 1947, deep in Mississippi. The air was thick with heat and the kind of quiet that makes even the crickets hold their breath. A boy named Elijah Carter stood by that muddy river, bare feet pressed into the soft bank, holding a fishing line that wasn't baited with hope anymore, just memory. He was 12, but already he carried the posture of a man too aware of the world's teeth. His father had taught him to fish right there. They'd stand side by side, the man's voice deep and calm, talking about patience, about keeping still so the water wouldn't spook. But what Elijah remembered most was the way his father's laughter used to echo over the current, light and full of life. The kind of laugh that made you believe everything was okay even when it wasn't. Then one morning, his father didn't come home. The story the white folks told was that he had talked back to Mr. Landry, the man who owned the land, the crops, and every black man's next meal in that county. They said his father got taken into town for a talk. Nobody ever said he came back, and nobody asked too many questions. Because in that part of Mississippi, questions had a way of getting you buried next to the answers. Elijah's mother never went to the sheriff. She never raised her voice. She just kept her head down and her hands busy. Washing, cooking, praying. Her face didn't change, but her eyes, those eyes that used to see everything, went still, like dark glass. One night, Elijah asked her, "Mama, where's Daddy?" Her hand stopped stirring the pot, but she didn't turn around. "He gone," she said softly. "And you don't need to ask nobody where." Then she looked at him, voice low but sharp. "Don't ever let them see you cry. You hear me?" He nodded, but that night, when she slept, he went back to the river. The moon hung low, thin as a blade. He stood there staring at the water, trying to see if maybe his father was still out there somewhere, caught between the reflection and the dark. He waited until the frogs stopped croaking, until even the night seemed afraid to move. Then quietly he cried, the kind of cry you keep hidden in your chest until it cuts you from the inside. In the morning, he went back to work in the fields beside his mother. Same rows, same sun, same silence. The other men didn't talk about what happened either. They just kept their heads down and their voices low. The white overseer rode by on his horse, tapping the crop stick against his thigh, slow and casual, like he was the only man alive who owned time. Elijah learned that silence wasn't just safety, it was survival. Every time he wanted to scream, he swallowed it down. Every time he wanted to ask why his daddy never came home, he dug his hands deeper into the dirt and kept planting. But the river kept whispering. Some nights it sounded like laughter. Some nights it sounded like chains. And sometimes, when the wind carried right, he swore he heard his father calling his name. That's when Elijah started to understand the world. Not from books or teachers, but from the looks in people's eyes. From the way his mama gripped his hand a little too tight whenever a white man walked by. From the way church prayers were whispered more like apologies than hope. He wasn't old enough to know the word for it, but he could feel it. The weight. The weight of being born into a place that told you you were less than human, and still having to wake up every day and smile polite. One evening, as the sun bled into the trees, Elijah picked up his father's old fishing pole and threw it into the river. It hit the water with a soft splash, then disappeared. "You can have it," he whispered. "You already took him." He stood there until the fireflies came out, until the light faded from gold to gray. Somewhere deep inside, he made himself a promise that he would never disappear like that. That one day the river would give something back. That was the night the boy stopped being a child. The night silence became his armor. The night the river claimed its first secret from the Carter family, and the world taught Elijah what it meant to be black in Mississippi. Because in 1947, freedom wasn't a right, it was a rumor. And every black boy learned early to keep his head down, his mouth shut, and his tears hidden where nobody could see. But the river saw. and it never forgot. By 1964, the boy by the river had become a man with oil on his hands and fire in his chest. Elijah Carter was 30 years old now, running a small garage on the edge of town, the kind of place where the sound of wrenches and gospel music filled the air all day long. Folks brought their cars and their problems to him because Elijah had a way of fixing both without saying much. The world around him was shifting. You could feel it in the air, the tension, the whispers, the courage being born in quiet rooms. The radio talked about marches, sit-ins, and something they called Freedom Riders. But in that corner of Mississippi, freedom still felt like a dream someone else was having. Elijah listened, but he didn't go to meetings. He told himself he had to stay out of trouble. He had a wife now and a little boy who asked too many questions. One warm evening, Elijah was driving home after closing the shop. The sun had just dipped behind the trees, leaving a deep orange glow on the road. He was thinking about dinner, about his son's laugh, about nothing dangerous at all, until the red and blue lights appeared in his mirror. He pulled over. The sheriff stepped out, chewing tobacco, face red from heat or hate. It didn't matter which. "Evening, boy," he said, voice stretched out slow. "You know why I stopped you?" Elijah shook his head. The man grinned. "Broken taillight. Can't have you riding dirty through my county." Elijah glanced back at his lights. They were fine. But he knew better than to argue. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. The sheriff walked around the car, tapping the trunk, peering inside, pretending to look for something to justify the stop. Then he leaned in close enough for Elijah to smell the whiskey on his breath. "You think all this marching and singing gonna change something, huh?" he whispered. "You people best stay in your place." Elijah kept his eyes on the steering wheel, jaw tight, heart pounding. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to ask why his father never came home, but he just nodded. "Yes, sir," the man smirked. "Smart boy." He tossed the license back at him, then spat on the ground. "Go on now, before I change my mind." Elijah drove home in silence, knuckles white on the wheel. His wife, Lorraine, met him at the door. She didn't ask what happened. She could tell by the way his shoulders hung. She just pressed a towel to his hand, where a small cut bled from gripping the gear too hard. "You can't let them take your peace," she whispered. But her voice shook when she said it. 2 weeks later, the church burned. It was a small wooden church on County Road 9, the one where Elijah's boy had been learning his Sunday verses. They said it was a lightning strike, but everybody knew it wasn't lightning. The smell of gasoline lingered long after the fire was out. 2 little girls were gone before the firemen even got there. The paper barely mentioned their names. That night, Elijah stood by the ruins with the rest of the town. The air was thick with smoke and sorrow. The preacher tried to speak, but his voice cracked halfway through the prayer. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers stood in silence, hands trembling, knowing the world still saw their lives as less than. Elijah didn't cry. He couldn't. The tears had dried out of him years ago. But something else filled their place, something heavier, something sharper. The next morning, he went back to his garage. He fixed cars for free that week. He patched tires, changed oil, tuned engines for young men heading to marches down in Jackson and Selma. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. He just nodded when they thanked him and said, "Keep your engine clean and your head down. At night," he'd drive some of them in his old pickup truck, headlights off down back roads, dropping them near the rally points. He never carried signs, never chanted, never showed his face in the crowd. But he was there. In every turn of the wrench, every secret ride, every whispered prayer. One night, a young man named Clyde came by the shop, his car sputtering. "Heard you can make a miracle out of scrap metal," he said with a grin. Elijah smiled faintly. "I just fix what's broke," Clyde nodded. "Then maybe you can help fix more than that." Elijah watched him go, his fists resting on the hood. The same river that once took his father flowed not too far behind the shop, and he could hear it moving in the distance, steady, patient, relentless. He realized it wasn't just carrying sorrow anymore. It was carrying voices, voices that refused to stay quiet. The fear never left him. Every time a police car passed, his stomach twisted. Every night he kissed his wife and son like it might be the last time. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the work anyway. So Elijah kept fixing cars, kept driving, kept listening to the river, and somewhere deep in him he knew this time the story wouldn't vanish. This fire wouldn't be forgotten. They might not write it down in their papers, but it was written into the people, into the soil, into the blood that refused to bow anymore. Because even when no one else was looking, Elijah Carter had already joined the movement, not with a speech or a song, but with grease on his hands, faith in his heart, and quiet rebellion in every breath he took. Marcus Carter came to Chicago chasing a story he'd been told since he was a boy. The North, they said, was freedom. The streets were lined with opportunity, not chains. No more fields, no more yes, sir, no more fear every time headlights appeared behind you. He packed one small suitcase, his father's old watch, and the hope that the city would be kinder than the soil he left behind. When the train pulled into Union Station, it felt like stepping into another world, cold air biting at his skin, buildings stretching into the clouds, people moving fast and not looking back. He told himself this was what progress looked like. A new beginning. He got a job at the post office, 6 days a week, walking block after block, delivering other people's dreams, college letters, paychecks, love notes, eviction notices. He carried their hopes in his bag, but his own stayed folded in his chest. The city had its own way of reminding him that freedom had fine print. His supervisor, a man with slick hair and a smile too tight, always found a reason to hold him back. "Not yet, Marcus," he'd say. "We need someone the customers can relate to." Marcus knew what that meant. It wasn't about skill or service, it was about skin. Promotions went to men who laughed too loud at bad jokes, who shared coffee and comfort where he never could. Still, he kept showing up, kept delivering, because that's what his father had done, worked through the weight, never letting them see him break. He rented a small apartment on the south side, where the wind whistled through cracked windows, and the landlords didn't bother fixing the heat. Every night he'd sit by the window writing letters to his father, even though he knew there was no address to send them to. Letters that started with "Dear Daddy" and ended with "I'm still trying." He'd fold them neatly, slide them into envelopes, and tuck them into an old cigar box under the bed. The box filled up over the years until it was too full to close. Marcus married a school teacher named Gloria, and together they had a daughter, Layla. She came into the world with her mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. When she was 5, she asked him why they couldn't move to the neighborhoods with the bigger parks and cleaner schools. Marcus tried to explain red lines drawn on maps decades before she was born, lines that said where they could live, where they couldn't, where hope was allowed to grow. He didn't tell her how he'd sat in a bank office once, tie tight around his neck asking for a home loan. The man behind the desk didn't even read the papers before saying no. "Not in that area," he'd said, pushing the forms back with a smile that stung worse than hate. Marcus worked double shifts instead, saved what he could. Every morning before the sun rose, he'd lace up his shoes, kiss Layla's forehead, and whisper, "They can't close your mind, baby." No matter what they close outside, Layla grew up hearing that phrase like a prayer. She watched her father's hands crack from winter cold, watched him iron his postal blues until the fabric thinned, watched him come home with the same quiet strength every night. He never complained. But she saw it, the weight in his shoulders, the way his laughter came slower each year. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, Marcus thought he could hear the river again. Not the one in Chicago, but the one that ran through Mississippi, the one that took his father. He felt it inside him still, moving through his blood, slow, heavy, relentless. He wondered if the river would ever stop following their family, if the North could ever wash away what the South had carved into them. One evening, after a long shift, he sat at the table while Layla did her homework. She looked up and said, "Daddy, what do you do when people don't see you?" He smiled, tired but proud. "You keep walking, baby. You keep showing up. 'Cause one day they'll have to." That night, after she went to bed, Marcus opened the cigar box again. He read the old letters, yellowed with time. The words blurred under his tired eyes. "Dear Daddy," he whispered, "I think I understand now. You didn't fight with fists. You fought by living. And I'm still fighting too. He closed the box and looked out the window, the city lights blinking like distant stars. The river wasn't gone, it had just changed shape. It ran through concrete now, through streets and hearts and generations, and it whispered the same message it always had. Atlanta, 2007. The sun poured down in gold streaks between the high-rise buildings, bouncing off car windows and glass towers. The city had changed, grown, built itself into something that looked like progress. But beneath the shine, the same old heartbeat still echoed, steady, cautious, aware. Layla Carter sat in traffic, her hands on the steering wheel, her son's voice coming from the back seat. Jamal was 9, big eyes, full smile, a mind that never stopped asking questions. "Mama," he said, "why you always get quiet when the police drive by?" Her fingers froze. The air conditioner hummed loud in the silence that followed. She wanted to say something simple, something easy, but nothing came out. She turned down the radio and took a deep breath. "Baby," she said softly, "we'll talk when we get home." That night, after dinner, Jamal sat on the couch with his comic books spread out. She watched him from the kitchen, her heart heavy. She'd been dreading this moment since the day he was born. The talk. Not the one about school or girls or growing up, but the one about surviving. She remembered her own father's words. "They can't close your mind, baby." But she also remembered his fear, the way his hands trembled slightly every time a siren wailed outside their apartment window in Chicago. She'd promised herself her son would live differently, that he'd grow up without carrying that kind of fear. But here it was again at her door. She sat next to him, legs crossed, voice soft. "Jamal, put your book down a minute." He looked up, sensing her tone shift. "Am I in trouble?" "No, baby. You're not in trouble. I just need to tell you some things. Important things," she hesitated. "How do you tell a child that the world might not love him the way he deserves to be loved? That his smile, his joy, his very existence might be seen as a threat by someone with a badge or a gun? When you see police and they stop you, I need you to do some things," she said. "Keep your hands where they can see them. Don't reach for anything, not even your phone. Say, 'Yes, sir,' 'No, sir.' Don't argue, even if you didn't do anything wrong. Just come home safe. You hear me?" Jamal frowned. "But why? They're supposed to help people." Her chest tightened. She looked into his eyes, the same eyes she'd seen in every generation before her. Her grandfather's quiet strength, her father's tired hope, her own reflection of both. "They're supposed to," she said, voice breaking. "But sometimes they don't see us the way we really are. Sometimes they just see something they were taught to fear." He stared at her, confused, trying to understand something too heavy for 9 years old. "Did they hurt you, Mama?" She blinked, her throat closing. "Not me, baby. But people like me, like you." She reached out, cupping his face. "You're smart and kind and funny. You're everything good in this world. But out there," she pointed toward the window, "some folks won't see that first. So you have to be careful until the world catches up to who you really are." He nodded slowly, the innocence still there, but dimmed a little. "Okay, Mama," she smiled through the ache. "And listen, don't let fear make you small. You walk tall. You speak truth. You love people hard, even when it's hard. That's how we fight back." He leaned against her shoulder. "I love you, Mama. I love you too, baby. Always." When he fell asleep later, she sat on the edge of his bed, brushing his curls from his forehead. The moonlight spilled through the window, and for a moment she saw her father standing there. Marcus, tired but proud, whispering the same lessons in another time, another city. Behind him, she could almost feel her grandfather, Elijah, with his quiet courage, standing by the river. The same river ran through them all. It carried their fear, their strength, their love. It carried every prayer whispered into the dark, every tear shed in silence. Layla walked to the window, staring out at the streetlights flickering below. She thought about all the things she'd had to swallow at work, the jokes that weren't jokes. The meetings where her ideas became someone else's. The polite smiles that said, "You're here, but don't get too comfortable." She'd fought so hard to build this life, to give her son everything. But no matter how far she climbed, the shadow of that river followed her. Still, she refused to drown in it. She thought about Elijah's promise by the riverbank, about Marcus's long walks through Chicago winters, about all the people who kept moving when the world tried to stop them. That night, she wrote a letter. Not to her boss, not to the police, but to her son's future. She wrote, "You are more than their fear. You are the dream they tried to bury, and you will rise anyway." She folded it, slipped it into a drawer beside his bed, and whispered, "When you're old enough, you'll read this. And maybe, just maybe, the world will be different." Then she turned off the light, kissed his forehead one more time, and let the silence settle. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, gentle and steady. Somewhere far away, the river still ran. The sky was soft gray when Jamal Carter reached the river. The same muddy water that once swallowed his great-grandfather's laughter now rolled past him in slow, endless motion. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the kind of smell that carried both memory and mourning. He stood there with his camera on a tripod, microphone clipped to his jacket, trying to steady his breath before hitting record. He'd spent months tracing the family history, old letters, worn photographs, faded newspaper clippings that never mentioned the truth. The story had always been passed down in whispers, too painful to tell out loud. But he wanted it on film now in the open, where no one could erase it. The red light blinked on. The lens focused, and Jamal began to speak. "My name is Jamal Carter," he said quietly. "My great-grandfather was Elijah Carter. My grandfather was Marcus. My mother is Layla. I'm here to tell their story and mine. Because if we don't tell it, somebody else will, and they'll tell it wrong." His voice cracked on that last line. But he didn't stop. He talked about Elijah first, the boy by the river, the man who fixed cars in the dark and carried courage in his silence. He described the fire that burned down the church, the two little girls whose names never made the paper, and how Elijah found his way into the movement without ever standing in a spotlight. Then he spoke about Marcus, the man who moved north chasing freedom, only to find another kind of cage made of red lines and quiet rejection. "He delivered mail for 30 years, Jamal said, looking straight into the lens. But he carried something heavier than letters. He carried the dream of a better life, and the weight of knowing it might not come in his lifetime." He paused, listening to the wind ripple through the trees. "And then there's my mother, Layla. She built what they could only imagine, a college degree, a house, a good job. But even then, she had to teach me how to survive. I was 9 years old when she sat me down and told me what to do if the police ever stopped me. I didn't understand it then, but now I do. That talk wasn't fear, it was love disguised as warning." He turned toward the water, the camera still rolling. "Every generation of my family tried to climb out of the river, but somehow it followed us. It's not just a place, it's a pulse. It's the sound of everything we've survived." He crouched near the edge, scooping a handful of water. It was cold, alive, heavy. He let it slip through his fingers. "They said the river forgets, but it doesn't. It remembers every name it ever took. And maybe it remembers how to give something back." Jamal set the camera to capture the slow current as he spoke again. "My great-grandfather's body was never found, but he left behind a line of people who refused to disappear. My grandfather taught my mother strength. My mother taught me truth. And now it's my turn." He looked into the lens, eyes shining with the mix of grief and peace that only comes from understanding. "This isn't a story about pain. Not really. It's a story about what comes after, about the people who kept walking when the world told them to kneel, about a family who kept loving, even when love felt dangerous." He took a deep breath, letting the river's sound fill the silence. "You see, healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering out loud, from speaking names that history tried to bury, from saying we were here until the world can't deny it." He stood again, the wind catching the edge of his shirt. "I used to hate this river," he admitted. "I thought it only took. But now I see. It gave, too. It carried us. It held the stories we were too afraid to tell. It kept them safe until we were ready to speak." He turned off the camera and stood still for a long time, staring across the wide brown water. Somewhere in that slow movement, he could almost feel them, Elijah, Marcus, Layla, all standing beside him, shoulder to shoulder, silent but strong. He thought about his mother's voice, trembling the night she gave him the talk, about his grandfather's tired smile when he said, "They can't close your mind, baby," about a promise whispered by a boy in 1947, throwing a fishing pole into this same river. "You already took him. You can't take me." Generations later, that promise had been kept. Jamal picked up a small stone from the shore and rubbed it between his fingers. "For you," he whispered. Then he tossed it into the river, watching the ripples spread outward, wider and wider, until they touched the opposite bank. He smiled through his tears. "That's how stories work," he said softly. "They ripple. One life touches another and another, until even the ones who tried to silence us have to listen." The sun began to set, painting the sky in gold and rose. The camera was still rolling, pointed at the water. Jamal stepped into the frame, his silhouette merging with the reflection of the river. He spoke one last time, voice steady now, almost like prayer. This river didn't just take, it carried. It carried names. It carried prayers. It carried love that refused to die. And now, it carries me. The sound of water filled the air, the same sound Elijah once heard as a boy, the same sound that whispered through every story that followed. And for the first time, it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like peace. Jamal turned toward the horizon, where the sky met the river, and smiled. "We're still here," he said. "We've always been here." Then he walked away, leaving the camera to capture the fading light, the river moving, alive, eternal, remembering everything and forgetting nothing.